Vanessa Holloway thought she was protecting the luxury image of the airline that night, but she had no idea she was humiliating the one woman capable of deciding whether the company survived another year. The polished floors of Terminal B reflected the soft amber glow of overhead lights as passengers moved through the airport with the tired rhythm of late evening travel. Expensive suitcases rolled across marble tiles. Quiet jazz drifted from the first-class lounge nearby. Outside the towering windows, rain streaked down the glass while a Boeing 777 prepared for its overnight flight from Chicago to San Francisco. Claire Whitmore stepped through the gate wearing a charcoal gray coat over a simple cream sweater, carrying a worn leather tote bag that looked older than some of the passengers waiting to board. At 39, Claire carried herself with a calmness that most people mistook for weakness. Her blonde hair was loosely tied back, and there was nothing about her appearance that suggested power, wealth, or influence. No designer labels. No jewelry beyond a thin silver wedding band she still wore long after her husband's death. Most people walking past her saw exactly what Vanessa Holloway saw the moment their eyes met. An ordinary woman who did not belong in first class. Vanessa stood near the boarding lane in her perfectly tailored navy uniform, posture flawless, red lipstick untouched after an 11-hour shift. She had built a reputation inside Skyline Air for maintaining what executives like to call the premium cabin atmosphere. To Vanessa, that meant more than service. It meant appearances, status, separation. She glanced briefly at Claire's tote bag and practical white sneakers before leaning slightly toward another flight attendant beside her. Another one trying to sneak into premium, she whispered under her breath with a small laugh. The younger attendant forced an uncomfortable smile but said nothing. Claire heard it anyway. She simply lowered her eyes toward the boarding pass on her phone and continued walking without reacting. That calm silence irritated Vanessa more than any argument would have. "Good evening, ma'am," Vanessa said loudly as Claire reached the scanner. "First-class boarding is for Group 1 only." Claire looked up politely. "Yes," she answered softly. "I'm Group 1. Vanessa extended her hand with a smile that looked professional from a distance but cold up close. Claire handed over her phone. The scanner beeped green immediately. Seat 2A. First class. Vanessa's expression tightened for only a second before recovering. "Interesting," she said lightly, handing the phone back. "You'd be surprised how often people accidentally end up in the wrong lane." A businessman nearby chuckled quietly while adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit jacket. Claire gave a small nod and continued down the jet bridge. The air inside the aircraft smelled faintly of coffee, leather seats, and recycled air. Soft golden lighting illuminated the first-class cabin while instrumental piano music played quietly overhead. Claire slid into seat 2A beside the window and placed her tote carefully beneath the seat in front of her. Outside, rainwater streaked across the glass while baggage crews worked under flashing runway lights. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion settling into her shoulders. Few people knew the last 12 months had nearly broken her. Since losing her husband Daniel to cancer the year before, Claire had disappeared almost entirely from public life. The tech foundation they built together had become one of the largest aviation AI companies in the country, but Claire rarely attended interviews anymore. She avoided photographs, avoided galas, avoided rooms full of people who confused visibility with value. Tonight's flight mattered because by morning she would decide whether Skyline Air received the emergency funding package that could save the struggling airline from collapse. Yet no one around her knew that. To the passengers filing into first class, Claire Whitmore looked invisible. Vanessa entered the cabin moments later, checking overhead compartments while greeting passengers with polished efficiency. But when she reached row 2, her eyes lingered on Claire again. Something about the simplicity bothered her. The quiet confidence. The complete absence of apology. Vanessa forced another smile. "Ma'am," she said sweetly, "are you sure you're seated in the correct cabin?" The nearby passengers slowly looked up. The room didn't become loud. It became worse. Quiet. Claire turned her gaze calmly toward Vanessa. "Yes," she answered gently. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And for the first time that night, a strange silence settled across the cabin like the beginning of a storm. The silence after Claire's answer lingered longer than anyone expected. Vanessa Holloway maintained her polished smile, but the slight tightening around her eyes revealed the irritation underneath. Flight attendants were trained to control cabins, control tension, control perception. And in Vanessa's mind, Claire Whitmore had already disrupted the atmosphere simply by existing too comfortably in a space Vanessa believed should belong to people who looked wealthier. "Of course," Vanessa replied smoothly, though her tone carried the faint edge of disbelief. "We just like to ensure all guests are properly accommodated." Claire gave a polite nod and turned her attention back toward the rain outside the window, signaling the conversation was over. That dismissal unsettled Vanessa even more. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple dressed in designer travel were exchanged quiet glances. The husband leaned toward his wife and muttered something that caused her to suppress a laugh behind her champagne glass. Claire heard that too. She heard all of it. Years ago, those moments would have embarrassed her. Before Daniel died, before boardrooms hardened her understanding of human nature, before wealth taught her how cruel people could become when they believed status gave them moral superiority. But now she simply folded her hands calmly in her lap. The aircraft doors closed with a heavy mechanical thud. Outside, runway lights glowed against the storm-dark tarmac while thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Inside first class, the soft hum of air conditioning mixed with the clicking of seatbelts and low conversations about stock markets, vacation homes, and conference meetings. Vanessa moved through the cabin offering pre-departure beverages with exaggerated warmth toward the visibly wealthy passengers. "Mr. Delaney, your usual bourbon?" she asked one man with a smile. "Mrs. Kensington, we chilled your sparkling water exactly the way you like it." But when she reached Claire, her professionalism cooled noticeably. "Would you like anything?" she asked quickly. Claire looked up gently. "Tea would be nice, thank you." Vanessa glanced briefly at Claire's simple tote bag again before replying, "We only serve premium loose-leaf tea in first class." The words sounded innocent enough to anyone not paying close attention. But Claire understood exactly what was being implied. She met Vanessa's gaze calmly. "That sounds perfect." For a split second, Vanessa seemed disappointed that the remark had failed to provoke embarrassment. "Very well," she said stiffly before moving on. A young flight attendant named Rachel quietly watched the interaction from the galley nearby. She had only worked for Skyline Air for 8 months, but even she recognized the subtle cruelty in Vanessa's behavior. Rachel noticed something else too. Claire never acted defensive, never over-explained herself. Wealthy passengers who felt insecure usually tried hard to prove they belonged. Claire did the opposite. She seemed entirely unbothered by anyone's opinion, and somehow that made the tension inside the cabin worse. 10 minutes later, as boarding completed, Vanessa returned carrying a porcelain cup balanced carefully on a tray. She placed it on Claire's table with mechanical politeness. "Your tea," she said. Claire thanked her softly and reached for the cup. At that exact moment, the plane shifted slightly during pushback from the gate. A small wave of tea splashed across the table and onto Claire's sleeve. "Oh," Vanessa said flatly, making no move to help. "You should be careful." The nearby businessman smirked into his phone screen while pretending not to notice. Claire calmly removed a napkin and dabbed the tea from her coat without complaint. "No problem," she said quietly. But Rachel saw the truth on Vanessa's face. It was not an accident Vanessa regretted. It was a test. Another attempt to make Claire uncomfortable enough to shrink into herself. Yet Claire remained, composed with a steadiness that almost felt unnatural. As the aircraft began taxiing away from the terminal, lightning briefly illuminated the cabin windows in silver flashes. Claire stared at the storm outside while absently touching the wedding band on her finger. Her mind drifted to the final conversation she had with Daniel inside a hospital room overlooking San Francisco Bay. "You always see people clearly," he had told her weakly, "even when they show you the worst version of themselves." Back then, she did not fully understand what he meant. Now she did. Across the cabin, Vanessa continued speaking with passengers, but her attention kept drifting back toward seat 2A. Something about Claire unsettled her instincts. The woman did not behave like someone pretending to belong. She behaved like someone observing the entire room from above it. And Vanessa, despite all her confidence, was beginning to feel that strange pressure that comes right before a mistake reveals itself. By the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude above the storm clouds, the atmosphere inside first class had settled into that carefully manufactured quiet common among wealthy travelers. Crystal glasses reflected the warm cabin lights. Laptop screens glowed softly in the dimness. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves as passengers discussed mergers, private schools, and Napa Valley vacation homes in voices just low enough to sound refined. Claire Whitmore remained silent near the window, her untouched tea cooling beside her, while city lights disappeared far below the clouds. Vanessa Holloway watched her from the galley with growing irritation. There was something deeply unsettling about a person who refused to react. Most passengers in Claire's position would have tried to prove themselves by now. They would mention connections, flash credit cards, complain to management, or force status into the conversation. But Claire did none of those things. She simply existed with a calm dignity that made Vanessa feel strangely exposed. "She is definitely not supposed to be here," Vanessa quietly muttered while organizing glassware in the galley. Rachel glanced nervously toward seat 2A. "Her ticket scanned correctly," she replied carefully. Vanessa gave a dismissive laugh. "People manipulate upgrades all the time. Trust me, I know the type." Rachel said nothing after that. She had learned quickly that disagreeing with Vanessa rarely ended well. Across the aisle from Claire, a silver-haired businessman named Leonard Briggs loosened his tie while sipping bourbon. Leonard was the kind of passenger Vanessa adored. Loud enough to appear important, rich enough to tip generously. He noticed Claire working quietly on her laptop and smirked. "You know," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "these airlines used to maintain standards." A few people looked up from their meals. Claire did not respond. Leonard leaned back comfortably in his seat. "Now everyone with an online coupon thinks they belong in first class." A woman beside him laughed softly into her wine glass. Vanessa approached immediately, smiling in that careful way service professionals do when they agree with something inappropriate but cannot openly say so. "We do our best to preserve the experience for valued passengers," she replied smoothly. The words hung in the cabin like perfume hiding something rotten underneath. Claire slowly closed her laptop. Her expression remained calm, but Rachel noticed the slight tightening in her fingers around the silver wedding band she still wore. There was pain there, old pain, not humiliation, something deeper. Leonard continued talking, emboldened by the lack of resistance. "It is always the quiet ones you have to watch," he joked. "Half of them are pretending." Another passenger chuckled under his breath. Claire finally turned slightly toward him, her voice soft enough that everyone had to stop talking to hear it. "Pretending to be what?" The cabin fell still. Leonard smiled smugly. "Successful." Claire studied him for a moment with the same calm expression she might have used while reading a weather report. "Interesting," she replied gently. "In my experience, truly successful people rarely need strangers to recognize it." The businessman's smile faltered slightly. Vanessa stepped in quickly before the silence could shift against her preferred direction. "Can I refresh your drink, Mr. Briggs?" she asked brightly. He nodded, grateful for the interruption. But something subtle had changed inside the cabin. The passengers who had quietly enjoyed the humiliation moments earlier now seemed uncertain. Claire's composure was beginning to unsettle them all. Vanessa returned minutes later carrying dinner service menus. She handed elegant leather-bound menus to each passenger before pausing at Claire's seat. "Unfortunately," she said with professional sympathy that sounded rehearsed, "we may have an issue with your meal selection." Claire looked up. "I requested vegetarian in advance." Vanessa nodded slowly. "Yes, but those requests are usually guaranteed for confirmed premium members." Rachel froze near the galley entrance. Even she knew that statement was false. Claire glanced briefly at the empty aisle before answering. "I confirmed it 3 days ago." Vanessa maintained her smile. "I am afraid there is no record of that." Another silence spread across the cabin. Leonard Briggs shook his head dramatically. "Always complications," he muttered. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, and for the first time that evening, exhaustion appeared on her face. Not weakness, grief, the kind that quietly follows people long after tragedy stops being visible to others. Vanessa mistook that silence for defeat. She leaned slightly closer. "We do have extra snack boxes in economy if necessary." Rachel's stomach tightened instantly. Even several passengers looked uncomfortable now. The insult had become too obvious to ignore. Claire slowly looked back up at Vanessa, her blue eyes steady beneath the warm cabin lights. Then she gave the smallest smile anyone on that plane had seen all night. Calm, controlled, almost sad. "Do not worry," she said softly. "I think the airline already has bigger problems than my dinner." And somewhere behind Vanessa's confident expression, the first real crack began to form. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as dinner service continued through first class, casting a warm amber glow across polished silverware and crystal glasses. Outside the windows, the storm had faded into endless black sky, the aircraft slicing quietly through clouds at 37,000 feet. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had become far colder than the weather outside. Vanessa Holloway could feel it even as she continued smiling at passengers. Claire Whitmore's last comment lingered in her mind with irritating persistence. "I think the airline already has bigger problems than my dinner." The sentence had sounded simple, almost casual, but there was something underneath it Vanessa could not shake. Confidence, not arrogance. Certainty. And certainty from quiet people was dangerous. Leonard Briggs swirled the ice in his bourbon glass and leaned toward Vanessa again as she cleared plates nearby. "You know," he said with a smirk, "you should really screen these upgrades better. Premium cabins lose value when anybody can wander in." Vanessa gave a tight laugh. "We work very hard to maintain standards, Mr. Briggs." Claire remained silent by the window, reading through a folder filled with printed reports. Rachel passed by and accidentally caught a glimpse of several pages covered with financial projections, acquisition charts, and airline restructuring notes. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Rachel frowned slightly but kept moving. Across the aisle, two passengers quietly whispered while glancing toward Claire. "Maybe she won some startup money," one muttered. "Or married rich," the other replied. Claire heard them too. She heard everything. But she no longer carried the need to defend herself to strangers. That need had disappeared years ago in boardrooms filled with men who mistook volume for intelligence. Daniel used to tell her silence unsettled insecure people because silence forced them to confront themselves. Tonight was proving him right again. Vanessa returned carrying a tray with warm towels. But when she reached Claire's row, her professionalism slipped further. "Ma'am," she said softly, though loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I need to ask again if you are certain you are seated correctly." Rachel froze in the aisle. Even Leonard Briggs looked surprised Vanessa was continuing this. Claire slowly lifted her eyes from the report in her lap. "You already asked me that." Vanessa nodded with fake patience. "Yes, but there seems to be some confusion with your account profile." Claire stared at her calmly. "What kind of confusion?" Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "You do not appear in our premium loyalty system." The cabin grew quieter. Claire closed the folder in her lap with careful precision. "I did not realize dignity required a membership number." A businessman near the front coughed awkwardly into his napkin. Vanessa's face tightened. "That is not what I meant." "Then what exactly did you mean?" Claire asked gently. The question landed harder than anger ever could have. Vanessa opened her mouth, then stopped, because for the first time that night, she realized several passengers were no longer automatically on her side. The cruelty had become too visible, too deliberate. Leonard Briggs attempted to recover the atmosphere with a laugh. "Come on now," he said loudly. "Nobody is being cruel. We just appreciate certain standards in first class." Claire turned toward him slowly. "Standards are important," she agreed quietly, "especially the way people treat others when they believe no consequences exist." The cabin went silent again. Rachel stood motionless near the galley, her heart pounding. Vanessa suddenly felt exposed beneath the soft cabin lighting, as though the entire aircraft could now see exactly what she had been doing all evening. Yet pride pushed her deeper instead of pulling her back. "Well," Vanessa said stiffly, "our passengers expect professionalism." Claire gave the faintest nod. "So do investors." Vanessa blinked. "Excuse me?" But Claire simply reopened her folder and said nothing more. 30 minutes later, the aircraft encountered light turbulence. Seatbelt signs illuminated overhead with a soft electronic chime, while the plane shifted gently through pockets of unstable air. Passengers adjusted blankets and drinks as flight attendants secured the cabin. Claire remained calm, staring thoughtfully out the window while distant lightning flashed silently across clouds below. Then, without warning, her phone vibrated once against the armrest. She glanced down briefly. A single message appeared on the screen. "Board approval complete. Ready for your decision." Claire looked at the words for several seconds. Around her, the first-class cabin continued floating inside its illusion of superiority, completely unaware that the future of the entire airline now rested quietly in the hands of the woman they had spent hours trying to humiliate. Claire slowly locked the screen, folded her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes for a moment. Somewhere behind her confident posture, Vanessa Holloway suddenly felt a strange knot tighten in her stomach, because deep down, instincts were beginning to whisper something terrifying. She had made a mistake, a very expensive mistake. The aircraft continued west through the night sky while most of the cabin settled into the artificial comfort of luxury travel. Soft blankets covered sleeping passengers. Empty wine glasses reflected dim overhead lights. The low hum of the engines blended with the occasional clink of silverware from the galley. But beneath the polished calm of first class, tension had begun spreading quietly from row 2 like cracks beneath frozen glass. Vanessa Holloway could feel it every time she glanced toward Claire Whitmore. The woman remained composed near the window, reviewing documents under the soft reading light above her seat while lightning flickered silently far below the clouds. No anger, no complaints, no effort to impress anyone. And somehow that frightened Vanessa more than confrontation would have. Rachel stood inside the galley pretending to organize service trays while watching Vanessa pace subtly back and forth. "You should probably let it go," Rachel whispered carefully. Vanessa immediately stiffened. "Excuse me? I just mean she has not actually done anything wrong." Vanessa let out a sharp breath through her nose. "You are new here, Rachel. Premium cabins are about maintaining standards. Once passengers feel uncomfortable, the entire experience collapses." Rachel glanced toward Claire again. "She does not seem like the problem." Vanessa said nothing after that, but irritation darkened her expression. Deep down, she knew Rachel was right, yet pride would not allow her to back away now, because the moment she admitted she had judged Claire unfairly, she would also have to confront the uglier truth underneath it. Across the cabin, Leonard Briggs pressed the call button beside his seat. Vanessa immediately approached with her polished smile restored. "Another bourbon, sir?" "Please," Leonard replied before lowering his voice slightly. "And honestly, thank you for handling that situation earlier. Some people really do not understand social boundaries anymore." Vanessa nodded carefully. "We aim to provide a certain atmosphere for our first-class travelers." Leonard smirked toward Claire's seat. "Exactly." Claire slowly closed the report in her lap and reached into her tote bag. She removed a small leather notebook worn soft with age and opened it quietly. Inside were handwritten notes beside several printed financial projections connected to Skyline Air. Numbers, debt structures, fleet replacement costs, labor concerns. She studied the pages silently while absent-mindedly turning the silver wedding band on her finger. Daniel's handwriting still appeared in the margins beside several investment notes. Sometimes the sight of it still hurt enough to steal her breath. The airline had no idea how close it truly was to collapse. Without emergency capital and restructuring technology from Claire's company, Skyline Air would likely be bankrupt within a year. Thousands of jobs would disappear. Entire routes would shut down. Claire had spent months debating whether saving the airline was worth the risk. Tonight was supposed to help her decide. Instead, she had spent hours watching exactly how the company treated people they believed held no power. A few minutes later, Vanessa approached row 2 again, this time carrying a printed passenger manifest in her hand. "Ma'am," she said with forced professionalism, "there still appears to be an issue verifying your premium travel profile." Several nearby passengers looked up immediately. Claire raised her eyes slowly. "You have checked 3 times already." Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "Company policy requires us to ensure the integrity of first-class seating." Claire studied her quietly for several seconds. "No," she said softly. "This is not about policy anymore." Vanessa's face hardened. "I beg your pardon?" Claire leaned back calmly in her seat. "This is about discomfort. Mine does not seem to bother you, but my presence bothers you very much." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to change the air pressure inside the cabin. Leonard Briggs shifted awkwardly in his seat. Even the passengers who previously smirked now avoided eye contact. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sharp electronic chime echoed through the cabin speakers. Rachel looked up immediately. That tone was not normal. Another chime followed from the galley communication panel. Then another. Vanessa frowned and walked quickly toward the front service station. A message flashed across the internal crew monitor in red priority text. "Contact Captain immediately. Executive Operations requesting live confirmation." Vanessa's stomach tightened. Flight crews rarely received direct operational interruptions during overnight service unless something serious had happened. Rachel stepped closer, reading the monitor over Vanessa's shoulder. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Vanessa did not answer, because another message appeared beneath the first 1 seconds later. "Priority status update regarding passenger in seat 2A. Vanessa froze completely. Her heartbeat suddenly became loud in her ears. Slowly, almost mechanically, she turned her head toward Claire Whitmore. And for the first time that entire night, fear quietly entered the room. Vanessa Holloway stared at the flashing message on the crew monitor as the color slowly drained from her face. "Priority status update regarding passenger in seat 2A. Beneath it appeared another line moments later. "Executive Operations request immediate cabin confirmation." Rachel looked between the screen and Vanessa with widening eyes. "Who is she?" she whispered. Vanessa swallowed hard but said nothing. Her carefully controlled confidence had begun collapsing beneath the pressure of uncertainty. The aircraft continued gliding smoothly through the dark sky while most passengers remained unaware that something inside the cabin had quietly shifted. But not all of them. Leonard Briggs noticed the sudden tension immediately. He lowered his bourbon glass as Vanessa hurried toward the interphone near the galley. Her hands, usually so precise and polished, now moved too quickly. She pressed the call button to the cockpit. "Captain Reeves," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Operations is requesting confirmation regarding passenger seat 2A. There was a pause. Then the captain's voice answered, lower and more serious than before. "Understood. Stand by." Vanessa glanced instinctively toward Claire Whitmore. Claire remained seated calmly beside the window, reviewing a financial document beneath the soft reading light as though nothing unusual was happening. That calmness now felt terrifying. 30 seconds later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Reeves stepped into first class wearing his dark navy uniform, silver wings reflecting the dim cabin lights. At 53, Reeves carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions thousands of feet above the ground. But the moment his eyes landed on Claire Whitmore, something unexpected happened. He stopped walking. The room seemed to hold its breath. Captain Reeves immediately straightened his posture. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I was not informed you were aboard tonight." Every conversation inside first class died instantly. Leonard Briggs lowered his drink. Vanessa's stomach twisted violently. Claire slowly looked up from her paperwork. "Good evening, Captain," she replied softly. Reeves hesitated for a moment before continuing carefully. Executive operations contacted the cockpit directly regarding your presence on this flight. Vanessa felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Rachel stood frozen near the galley entrance. Several passengers now openly stared toward seat 2A. Claire closed the folder in her lap. I assume they are overreacting again. Captain Reeves almost smiled. Respectfully, ma'am, when Skyline Air's primary investor boards one of our aircraft without security notification, people tend to react. Silence. Absolute silence. Leonard. Briggs blinked rapidly as though trying to process the sentence. Vanessa's expression emptied completely. Claire Whitmore calmly folded her hands together while the cabin around her seemed to collapse into disbelief. Reeves continued carefully, clearly aware that everyone nearby was listening now. The board received your message 20 minutes ago. Vanessa's breath caught. Message. Claire had already done something. And? Claire asked quietly. Captain Reeves lowered his voice slightly. The emergency restructuring review has officially been frozen pending your final recommendation after landing. Several passengers exchanged stunned glances. Leonard Briggs slowly set his bourbon glass down on the tray table with trembling fingers. Vanessa stared at Claire as realization spread across her face piece by piece. The simple woman she had spent hours humiliating was not just wealthy. She was the reason the airline still existed. Captain Reeves shifted awkwardly before speaking again. Ma'am, Executive Operations also requested I personally apologize if your experience tonight has been anything less than professional. The sentence landed like thunder inside the silent cabin. Vanessa felt heat flood her face as every interaction from the evening replayed brutally in her mind. The tea spill, the comments, the repeated questioning, the humiliation. Claire looked toward the captain calmly. Thank you, Captain. None of this is your fault. Her eyes briefly shifted toward Vanessa, not with anger, but disappointment. Somehow that hurt more. Vanessa stepped forward suddenly, voice unsteady for the first time all night. Ms. Whitmore, I had no idea. Claire regarded her quietly. No, she replied softly. You did not. Vanessa opened her mouth again, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to defend. No misunderstanding, no confusion, only judgment, pure and ugly. The first-class cabin remained frozen in silence while the truth settled heavily over everyone inside it. The wealthy businessman who mocked her now avoided eye contact entirely. The passengers who quietly laughed earlier stared down at their laps. Even the soft piano music overhead suddenly felt distant and hollow. Claire Whitmore slowly removed the silver wedding band from her finger and turned it gently between her hands. Her expression touched briefly by sadness older than this entire situation. Then she looked back toward Captain Reeves. Tell the board I will make my final decision after I see how this airline chooses to treat people when no one important is watching. And in that moment, every person in first class realized she had been watching them the entire time. After Captain Reeves quietly returned to the cockpit, the atmosphere inside first class no longer resembled luxury. It resembled judgment. The soft lighting, polished silverware, and expensive clothing suddenly felt meaningless beneath the crushing silence that had settled over the cabin. No one looked at Claire Whitmore the same way anymore. But somehow the change in their expressions only revealed how shallow their respect had always been. Leonard Briggs stared down at the melting ice in his untouched bourbon glass, unable to bring himself to speak again. The confidence that once filled his voice had disappeared completely. Across the aisle, the passengers who laughed earlier now sat rigidly in embarrassed silence, pretending to focus on phones and laptops they were no longer reading. Vanessa Holloway remained standing near the galley entrance, frozen between humiliation and disbelief. Her entire career had been built on reading people quickly. She prided herself on spotting wealth, importance, status. Yet somehow she had completely failed to recognize the one person on that plane whose opinion truly mattered. Worse than that, she had exposed something ugly about herself in the process. Rachel quietly approached Claire's seat holding a fresh cup of tea with trembling hands. Ms. Whitmore, she said softly, I brought you another tea. I made sure this one stayed hot. Claire looked up at the young attendant, surprised by the kindness in her voice. "Thank you," she replied gently. Rachel hesitated for a second before lowering her eyes. "I am sorry for tonight." Claire studied her face carefully. Unlike the others, Rachel's apology did not sound motivated by fear. It sounded sincere. Claire accepted the tea with a small nod. "Kindness still matters," she said quietly. Rachel swallowed hard and stepped back toward the galley, blinking rapidly as emotion tightened her throat. Vanessa watched the interaction from several feet away, shame creeping deeper into her chest. Because for the first time that night, she realized Claire never cared about status. She cared about character, and Vanessa had failed that test completely. A sudden chime echoed through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Reeves announced calmly, "we are beginning our initial descent into San Francisco. Weather conditions are clear, and we expect to arrive approximately 20 minutes ahead of schedule." The announcement faded, but the tension remained. Claire turned her attention back toward the dark window beside her seat. Far below, faint city lights shimmered through breaks in the clouds like scattered gold across black water. San Francisco. Daniel loved this city. The memory hit unexpectedly hard. For a moment, Claire closed her eyes as grief quietly resurfaced beneath her calm exterior. 1 year earlier, she and Daniel had sat together inside another aircraft discussing whether Skyline Air was worth saving. He believed companies reflected the values they tolerated. "Watch how they treat people with nothing to offer them," he told her. "That tells you everything." Tonight had given Claire her answer. Leonard Briggs suddenly cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I may have spoken out of line earlier." Claire slowly turned toward him. The businessman who once mocked her now looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence money usually gave him. "Perhaps," Claire replied softly. Leonard forced an uncomfortable smile. "I hope you understand none of us realized who you were." Claire's expression remained calm, but there was sadness behind her eyes now. "That is exactly the problem." Silence swallowed the cabin again, because everyone understood what she meant. Respect had only arrived once wealth entered the conversation. Vanessa stepped forward slowly, her polished composure finally collapsing beneath the weight of guilt. "Ms. Whitmore," she began quietly, "there is no excuse for how I treated you tonight." Claire looked at her steadily. Vanessa's voice shook slightly. "I kept assuming things about you because of how you looked. I thought I was protecting the image of first class. But," her words faltered, "but I became exactly the kind of person this airline should fear." Claire held her gaze for several long seconds. Around them, the entire cabin remained perfectly still. Even the soft engine noise seemed distant beneath the tension hanging in the air. Finally, Claire spoke. "People reveal themselves when they believe someone has no power," she said quietly. "That is why moments like this matter." Vanessa lowered her eyes. The truth hit harder than anger ever could. Claire was not humiliating her in return. She was simply allowing reality to stand untouched. No raised voice, no revenge, just honesty. And honesty inside silence can feel unbearable. The aircraft descended lower through the clouds as city lights grew brighter beneath the wings. Somewhere ahead, Skyline Air executives were already waiting on the ground, terrified about the decision Claire Whitmore would make after tonight. But inside first class, another realization was settling heavily over every passenger and crew member aboard. The most important person on the plane had never demanded respect once. And that was exactly why she deserved it. The aircraft descended through the final layer of clouds as San Francisco spread beneath the wings in glittering ribbons of light. Inside first class, nobody seemed interested in luxury anymore. Half-finished drinks sat untouched beside expensive watches and designer handbags. The confidence that once filled the cabin had evaporated completely, replaced by a heavy silence that no one knew how to escape. Vanessa Holloway remained near the galley with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, replaying every moment of the night in painful detail. Each sarcastic smile, each judgmental glance, each attempt to make Claire Whitmore feel small. What terrified her most was not the possibility of losing her job. It was realizing how natural the cruelty had felt at the time. "Claire," sat quietly by the window while the city lights reflected softly across her face. She no longer looked like a passenger inside the cabin. She looked like someone carrying the weight of decisions far larger than anyone around her could understand. Her leather notebook rested closed on the tray table beside Daniel's wedding band. For several minutes, she simply stared out into the darkness without speaking. Then her phone vibrated once again. A message from Skyline Air's board chairman appeared across the screen. Executive team waiting on arrival. Requesting opportunity to speak before final decision. Claire read the message silently before locking the phone again. Vanessa noticed the movement and slowly approached seat 2A with careful hesitation. There was no trace of arrogance left in her posture now. "Ms. Whitmore," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" Claire turned toward her calmly. Vanessa swallowed hard. "When did you realize what kind of person I was?" The question hung in the cabin like confession. Claire studied her for a moment before answering softly. "The first time you looked at my clothes instead of my face." Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. Nearby passengers listened without pretending otherwise anymore. There was nowhere left to hide from the truth inside that cabin. Claire continued gently, not cruelly, which somehow made every word heavier. "You decided who deserved dignity before you ever spoke to me." Vanessa's voice nearly broke. "I am sorry." Claire nodded once. "I believe you are." The flight attendant blinked rapidly, struggling against emotion. "But I do not think you understand yet that this was never about me." Vanessa looked up slowly. Claire gestured subtly around the cabin. "There are people treated this way every day who do not have money or influence to protect them afterward." Silence followed, because every person listening knew she was right. Leonard Briggs quietly removed his expensive watch and stared at it absently, as though realizing for the first time how meaningless status symbols could become when stripped of character. Rachel stood nearby holding onto the service cart just to steady herself emotionally. The aircraft touched down moments later with a gentle shudder against the runway. Tires hummed across wet pavement while soft applause scattered awkwardly through economy class farther behind them. Inside first class, nobody clapped. Captain Reeves' voice came calmly over the speakers. "Welcome to San Francisco." The plane taxied slowly toward the gate while tension tightened once again inside the premium cabin. Outside the windows, several black SUVs and airport operations vehicles waited unusually close to the arrival gate. Passengers noticed immediately. Murmurs spread quietly through first class. "Who are they waiting for?" someone whispered. Vanessa already knew the answer. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime, but nobody stood up yet. Then the aircraft door opened. Two Skyline Air executives in dark overcoats entered the cabin almost immediately, followed by airport operations staff carrying tablets and folders. The older executive at the front scanned the cabin anxiously until his eyes found Claire Whitmore. His entire posture changed. "Ms. Whitmore," he said quickly, "thank you for flying with us tonight." The first-class passengers watched in stunned silence as the executive continued. "On behalf of Skyline Air, I want to personally apologize for your experience on board." Claire remained seated. "You should apologize to your employees too," she replied quietly. The executive looked confused. Claire glanced briefly toward Vanessa and Rachel. "One of them forgot what dignity looks like," she said softly. The other remembered. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly, shame washing over her again. The executive straightened immediately. "We will address this situation internally." Claire slowly stood for the first time since boarding. The entire cabin unconsciously moved aside as she stepped into the aisle with quiet grace. No anger, no dramatic triumph, just presence. She picked up her worn leather tote bag, slipped Daniel's wedding band carefully back onto her finger, and looked once more across the silent passengers surrounding her. "Companies rarely collapse because of numbers," she said calmly. "They collapse because people stop seeing humanity in each other." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because deep down, every person in that cabin understood they had just witnessed something far more uncomfortable than power. They had witnessed truth. The cold night air of San Francisco swept through the open aircraft door as passengers slowly gathered their belongings in uneasy silence. No one rushed anymore. The usual impatience of first-class travelers had vanished somewhere between 37,000 feet and the truth they had just witnessed. Claire Whitmore stood calmly near the front of the cabin with her worn leather tote resting lightly against her shoulder, while Skyline Air executives waited beside the aircraft entrance with nervous expressions. Beyond the jet bridge windows, rain shimmered beneath airport floodlights, casting silver reflections across the tarmac. The older executive cleared his throat carefully. "Ms. Whitmore, transportation has been arranged for you downtown. The board is prepared to meet whenever you are available." Claire looked toward him quietly. "Not tonight." The executive blinked in surprise. "Of course," he replied quickly. "Tomorrow morning then?" Claire paused for a moment before answering. "Tomorrow morning I want a full review of employee culture complaints across the company. Not financial reports. Not stock analysis. People." The executive immediately nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Behind them, passengers began slowly filing past in complete silence. Leonard Briggs avoided looking directly at Claire as he stepped into the aisle. The confidence that once surrounded him like expensive cologne had disappeared entirely. Before leaving the aircraft, he stopped beside her awkwardly. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you taught everyone on this flight something tonight." Claire studied him calmly. "I hope so." Leonard lowered his eyes. "Most people with power would have destroyed careers after what happened." Claire glanced briefly toward Vanessa Holloway standing near the galley with red eyes and trembling hands. "Fear changes behavior temporarily," she said softly. "Understanding changes it permanently." Leonard nodded slowly, unable to respond. Then, he disappeared down the jet bridge without another word. One by one, the remaining passengers left the aircraft carrying far more discomfort than luggage. The silence inside first class grew heavier with every empty seat until only the crew, the executives, Rachel, Vanessa, and Claire remained beneath the warm cabin lights. Vanessa finally stepped forward, her composure completely stripped away now. "Ms. Whitmore," she whispered, "I know I do not deserve kindness after tonight." Claire said nothing. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "But I need you to know. This was not just about you." Her voice shook. "I do this all the time. I judge people before they speak, before I know anything real about them. And tonight I finally saw how ugly that looks." The confession hung in the empty cabin like truth finally exposed to light. Claire looked at her quietly for several seconds. Then she spoke in the same calm tone she had used all evening. "The hardest part about dignity," she said softly, "is that every person deserves it before they prove anything to you." Vanessa lowered her head completely. Rachel stood nearby wiping tears from her face silently. Even the executives remained motionless, understanding this moment mattered more than corporate damage control. Claire slowly reached into her tote bag and removed a folded photograph. It showed her and Daniel years earlier standing beside a small private plane with wind in their hair and sunlight across their faces. They looked impossibly happy. Claire traced the edge of the photograph gently with her thumb before speaking again. "My husband believed companies reveal their soul through ordinary moments," she said quietly. "Not board meetings, not press releases. Moments like tonight." The older executive swallowed hard. "Can Skyline Air fix this?" Claire looked toward Rachel first, then toward Vanessa, finally toward the empty first-class cabin where judgment had once felt more important than humanity. "That depends," she replied softly, "on whether people here are willing to see others clearly before status tells them to." Outside the aircraft windows, rain continued falling steadily across the airport lights while ground crews moved quietly beneath the dark California sky. Claire slipped the photograph carefully back into her bag and turned toward the jet bridge. The executives instinctively stepped aside to let her pass. But before leaving the aircraft completely, Claire paused one final time and looked back toward Vanessa Holloway. "Do better next time," she said gently. "Not angry, not cruel, just honest." Vanessa nodded through tears. "I will." Claire gave a small smile and walked into the quiet glow of the terminal beyond the aircraft door. No dramatic music, no applause, no revenge, just silence. The kind of silence that stays with people long after the moment ends. And somewhere above the rain-covered runways of San Francisco, an airline that almost collapsed that night was given one final chance to remember what dignity looks like.